Okay, I guess we are already online. So welcome to our next seminar of Eurasia Talks. And as usually, we have great guests and very interesting topic. So to present our today's guest and topic, I would like to ask my colleague, Ishik Hojam, please, could you introduce our guest?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Eurasia Talks seminars. Today we are with Dr. Burkhanov. Aziz Burkhanov is an associate professor at the Nazarbayev University, and he has joined the Graduate School of Public Policy. In 2014, He's a graduate of, actually, we're both IU, Indiana University alumni. He is particularly interested in national identity politics, policies and practices, nationalism and identity theories, and I think all are relevant issues in the post-Soviet world still. And always a hot topic regarding Kazakhstan. And I'm personally very much interested in these debates, and I try to follow. Let's hear what Dr. Burkhanov has to say about these issues. Thank you very much for coming. Please, Aziz, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. First of all, I would like to say that it is indeed a great honor and pleasure to be here. So thanks very much for the organizers, Dr. Ishik, especially coming from Indiana University background, alumni. It's a great pleasure to reconnect. So again, once again, thank you very much for this kind of invitation. And in today's presentation, I'll talk about well, I guess narratives about nation building in Kazakhstan. Particularly, I'll try to make sort of an overview of different competing, perhaps sometimes overlapping narratives that exist in the public discourse of Kazakhstan related to the issues of nation building, nationalism, interethnic relationship. Particularly, as it was said before, I'm also interested in the media discourses, and I will also make a little bit of an overview of how different linguistic realms may also have different narratives, and I will also share some of the results of recent surveys that me and some colleagues of mine have done on the societal perception. So we'll look at different levels of narratives about nation building in Kazakhstan. So once again, thanks very much for this invitation, and I'll be delighted to share some thoughts and some ideas here. I would like to start sharing my screen, if that's okay. Okay, perfect. Let me know if it's visible. If all good,
yeah.
And all good. All right. So once again, the topic for tonight's session is nation building narratives, specifically narratives because I got interested in the whole question of public discourse, how different issues can be interpreted very differently or discussed very differently, in fact, in different linguistic realms. And this particularly is salient for Kazakhstan, a country in which two languages, Kazakh and Russian, are widely used in public discourse, in business and government. So country is having this dichotomy between two different linguistic realms, and this is one of the major sources of this debates about the future of the country, ethnic relationship, and nation building. So the structure of tonight's talk, as I said earlier, I'll try to make a very brief overview of the nation building efforts, what is being done by the country, by the government, how proactive, if you will, the government was or wasn't in shaping up this new identity policy. And I think it's fair to say that for a while, this was not that much of a priority for the country for a variety of reasons that I will discuss later. Later on, we switch and talk about media discourses, and I'll show results of of this research that I've been doing for quite a while about media narratives in Kazakh and Russian language media outlets of Kazakhstan, and then we'll talk about how all this also reflects in societal discourse in the society. What is the societal perception, preference, societal view on the nation building project? And of course, here, this is something that, well, it's a very important disclaimer. In fact, this is something that is still a very much ongoing debate. So, of course, I'll try to make it more recent, but more connected with more recent discussions. But again, this is a discussion that has been going for a while and is still very much ongoing, and perhaps will be on the agenda for quite a while, because nation building in Kazakhstan, it is one of the most important issues. It is, well, Kazakhstan itself is a very interesting case. So there is a lot of interesting stories to uncover here. All right, well, very briefly about the national sort of identity policy in Kazakhstan. As I mentioned at the beginning, for quite a while, many scholars argue that for quite a while, essentially, government was not very interested in promoting and proactively promoting the sense of identity. The government was trying to use a more careful approach, more gradual approach vis-a-vis nation building. And if you look at the discourse, the policy statements, public speeches by government officials, a lot of that is focused on interethnic stability, which is important. But the core of this discourse is based on the idea that the country that has a very diverse ethnically, religiously, linguistically population has avoided, for the most part anyway, major interethnic conflicts. And government for quite a while, and still is in fact, promoting or making the case for the successful integration policy, essentially arguing that indeed interethnic stability is one of the major achievements that the government has made. So no any major violent conflicts. And we'll say a few words about this later. But there were in fact, of course, ethnic cases of ethnic violence last year in Kordai, southern part of the country. There were several other incidents. So of course it's not as maybe as perfect, but government still focuses primarily on this sort of absence of large-scale, ethnically inspired violence. Another big statement that we can see quite often in the government discourse is this focus on 130, sometimes 140 ethnic groups living in peace together, which is also which has been criticized widely in the media, especially in Kazakh language discourse media, essentially saying that, well, all this, numbers, they do not always or do not entirely reflect the ethnic composition of the country. This is a bit more of an artificial sort of construct. But government, again, focuses on this sort of highlighting this ethnic diversity that exists in the country. Assembly of People, that's a very important institution in Kazakhstan nation building. Essentially, it acts as some sort of an umbrella agency which oversees those so-called national cultural centers, in which most, not all, but most ethnic groups are given this national cultural centers, which usually receive some state funding. They take part in all kinds of celebrations, ethnic, religious, and so on. Also, it's very important to mention ethnicity in Kazakhstan is recorded in the ID cards, domestically used ID cards. And here I'll show a picture of this. It's the old format, of course, but still here on this graph, you have draft Nationalist or old, which essentially stands for the ethnic sort of affiliation. This is still very much in case in Kazakhstan. There were several, well, there were some discussions about removing this, but at least for the time being, that is still very much in place. Also, there were attempts, mostly fairly sporadic rather than systematic, attempts to create some kind of a new approach to identity. One of the most perhaps notorious was this initiative called Kazakhstani Nation. So the idea was that everyone living in the country, regardless of ethnic origin, ethnic background, would be considered as sort of member of Kazakhstani Nation. And that, interestingly enough, that initiative also sparked a lot of debates. And interestingly enough, again, quite a lot of people were not on board with this and saying, well, we don't really want to lose our own ethnic identity. We want still, to be Kazakhs or Russians or Ukrainians or Germans or Tatars, but we don't really want what Kazakhstani nation means. And so there are some interesting debates in the media about this. So that's the sort of general overview of identity policy in Kazakhstan. But of course, we can also mention all kinds of challenges that exist for the nation building, because eventually there are competing narratives about this more of a inclusive civic or citizenship-based identity and Kazakhstan, sort of Kazakhstani nation. That's the idea of Kazakhstani nation is all about, and also ethnic multiculturalism, where people would still prefer to see their ethnic identity being respected, being recorded, being prized, being celebrated. Another big challenge, of course, is the linguistic composition in the country, which I would argue is one of the perhaps most serious challenges that exist in the country. Problem is not necessarily about two languages being used, but problem may be in the fact that the narratives that circulate in those two linguistic realms are very different. And at some point, the very understanding of what is Kazakhstani, what is identity, what kind of identity this country should foster are fundamentally different in the two linguistic realms. Narratives of history, language, interethnic relationships are quite often very different. Kazakh language discourse, which primarily embarks speaking Kazakhs. And again, if anyone in the audience is interested in this whole history of this linguistic dichotomy, I'll be happy to discuss this more in the questions, but I won't go into sort of historical peculiarities for the time being. But Kazakh language discourse in the country tends to focus a lot in the Kazakh ethnic culture, which means history, specifically of the Kazakh ethnos, culture, language. Russian language discourse, which is encompassing more than just ethnic, obviously Russians, but also urban Kazakhs who've been growing up, primarily being educated in Russian, also other ethnicities. Here, the question of identity is a bit more is based on the idea of shared identity. So we all live in this country. We all happen to live here, so we share the state. And these two discourses, again, as I will illustrate in a moment, are indeed very, very different. Same for the language. Language policy in Kazakhstan has also been under quite a lot of exploration studies. Kazakh is granted the state language status, and this Kazakh is the only state language because there are sometimes some confusions about Russian sort of being granted the state language status in Kazakhstan. That's not the case. Russian is given this very ambiguous status. Basically, the law states that it can be used on an equal basis in government institutions. So in other words, it can be officially used. So many somewhat simplistically perhaps call it official language in Kazakhstan, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not a state language. And then also, of course, it's worth mentioning that there were several programs of Kazakh language implementation with different degrees of success. There's also a 50-50, well, it's more complicated than that, but let's call it 50-50 for the time being, quota usage in the media. So the idea is that broadcast in other languages should not be less than broadcast in Kazakh. So it's a bit more complex than 50-50, but again, many people call it that way. At the same time, Russian is still widely used in the country. And perhaps it's worth saying that, at least for the time being, certainly, one could say it's certainly declining, but it's still very much widely used in the country. Also, it's worth mentioning the discussion about the, there are some political forces in the country that seek to see, stronger, stricter policies. Essentially, there are some forces in the country that essentially criticize the government for not being nationalist enough, for not being persistent enough in making Kazakh language sort of a real, sort of the way they see it, real state language. At the same time, it's worth saying that indeed there is a much broader usage of Kazakh language in the latest, last couple of decades. Country is a lot more Kazakh speaking. Of course, it depends very much on the regional context. Obviously, in the north, Russian is more used. And there are some areas in the south where Russian is pretty much gone. So again, it very much depends on a specific locality. At the same time, demographically, there are also substantial changes. Ethnic Russians, well, quite a few of ethnic Russians have migrated to Russia or elsewhere. And there is also a demographic trend of influx of Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs, from rural areas to cities. And here we obviously have to remember, make a reference to the Soviet time where, urban areas in Soviet Kazakhstan were primarily non-Kazakh or primarily Russian. Many Kazakhs, ethnic Kazakhs happen to live in rural areas. So it's a very important ethnic, but also economic, socio-demographic sort of feature of the Soviet Kazakhstan. So now demographic trends are essentially where many ethnic Kazakhs moving to rural area, from rural areas to cities, they change the demographic composition largely. So this is the sort of in a very basic overview of language policy, and I will be happy to discuss this more in the Q&A session. But for the time being, I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk perhaps a bit more about the media discourse. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Kazakh and Russian are the languages that are very much being used in the media discourse, and I will perhaps share some of the results of this research project that has been going on for quite a while about the narratives and two different linguistic realities. So as just an example, I'll share the discourse in these four national media, the four print newspapers. And of course, we can obviously make a disclaimer here that certainly print media in general, worldwide, perhaps are certainly losing quite a bit of audience popularity. Perhaps a lot of societal discourse shifts to to online media outlets. That of course is all true, and I think it's fair to say that indeed in Kazakhstan we see pretty much the same process where more and more outlets shift to be only online or online and print form, but for the most part we see very similar patterns. And here of course we also have to make another important disclaimer. One could ask, well, of course in a country in which certainly there are some issues with media freedom, so how important all this stuff is. And I would argue that even in a fairly authoritarian context of Kazakhstan, media outlets, especially when it comes to issues of language, issues of nationalism, issues of nation building, they do offer quite a lot of insights, quite a lot of interesting discussions you can still find. And in fact, here a lot of the discussion happens, in this very much public discourse. So I'll just maybe share some of the quotes from some of the media outlets. And of course, this I have a lot of articles collected from those media, so I'll try to show more recent debates. But this timing, the retrospective timing, might also demonstrate that this is a discussion that country went through or has been going through for almost 30 years of independence. It is pretty much still a very an ongoing debate. So if we look at the very early articles, right after independence, a long time ago, here, of course, in the Russian language paper, Kazakhstanskaya Pravda, which is sort of official, government-owned Russian language paper. Here, some discussion here about, all of us, Kazakhs, Russians, Ukrainians, we all lived in the country. We must become a united people, because we are all Kazakhstanis, мы все казахстанцы. And a lot of that sort of tonality was there for quite a while, and still is in some of the Russian language government-owned papers. Traditions of friendship between people exist here for centuries, and of course, new generations must also accept that. Otherwise, we all live in this land, we all share this country. This is again from Kazakhstanskaya Pravda, published in 2007. But again, I have more articles like that, more recent times as well. But if we look at Kazakh language discourse, especially in Drasalash, which is a newspaper of sort of Kazakh intelligentsia, if you will, here the narrative is a little different. Here the paper says, well, builders of this state are Kazakhs, and we should probably sort of get rid of this slogan called, laboratory of people's friendship, or in Russian that would be Laboratoriya Druzhby Narodov, as Kazakhstan was oftentimes referred in Soviet discourse. So here the paper says, well, if representatives of other ethnic groups, if they consider themselves Kazakhs, they can become sort of part of the Kazakh sort of nationhood. But we must acknowledge that builders of this state are indeed Kazakhs. Also, an article about all this debate about, this 130 ethnic groups living in Kazakhstan. And here the paper says, well, if you look at the statistics agency data, there are only 6, well, they call them nationalities, but again, this is from the Soviet Nationalist. There are only 6 ethnic groups in the country which exceed 1%. So Kazakhs, Russians, Uzbeks, Ukrainians, Uyghurs, Tatars, and Burmans. All other 124 nationalities make only about 5% combined. So that's why we can't really be talking about 130 ethnicities living in the country, because the statistics don't really show this. We see the opposite picture. And their argument is that, well, in Kazakhstan, there's only one Kazakh nation and 6 ethnicities. And there are a lot of similar arguments being made in the papers. There is also some discussion about Kazakhstani nation. I will just show maybe one quote here, again from Drasalash. When this concept was introduced by the government, there was a very heated reaction from both sort of Kazakh, sort of more nationalist discourse, but also from other ethnic groups. Many people were not necessarily happy with the idea and said, well, we are afraid of losing our identity. If we become Kazakhstani, we lose our ethnic culture, our ethnic affiliation. And some of the Kazakh language discourse took it further and said, well, this whole idea about Kazakhstani nation is brought to us from abroad. It's those, evil forces from outside. They want to destroy our, great Kazakhhness, because if we become Kazakhstani, obviously there is no need in Kazakh language, which of course is, government, for the sake of discussion, objectivity government never really said that, Kazakh language will disappear. It's just, again, the tonality, the interpretation of discussion here we see is very much anti this very, civic sort of driven identity. Again, another article from Drasalash, Kazakh language in the Kazakh state, and they call Kazakhstan essentially Kazakh state. Kazakh Yele is the term that they use, literally means Kazakh state. Kazakh language should be first, and why do our diasporas, but diasporas, they mean essentially ethnic groups living in the country. So, but they do not respect Kazakh traditions. They do not speak Kazakh language. There is no any other country in the world that has this sort of situation. So as we can see in the media discourse, situation is indeed much more diverse than the government discourse would suggest. Again, there are some competing narratives about vision for the future of the country, language status, interethnic relationship, and so on. Maybe a couple of other quotes. Of course, a lot of disclaimers have to be made. A lot of those publications are from earlier times, but again, this is a discussion that is still very much ongoing. So this is again from Drasalash paper, an article rather that is reporting about the language used in the police force in Kazakhstan, and they basically they argue that, well, it looks like the Interior Ministry, the one that oversees the police force in Kazakhstan essentially counts Russian as the state language. Otherwise, how can we explain that all the police paperwork is still done in Russian, and meetings, up to 80% of meetings are still being held in Russian. Ethnic Kazakhs make up to 90% of the entire police force, and yet even in those areas of Kazakh, Jambul, southern Kazakhstan, and those are regions that are perhaps most Kazakh, and most where ethnic Kazakhs are clearly a majority. Even there, in those regions, police documentation, police paperwork is still being produced in Russian. And of course, situation has changed since then, but it's not entirely different from what they describe here. So there is a fair amount of question of sometimes some of the newspapers are taking it very emotional. And this again, this paper here, this article here says, well, if we in this article, particular article here, the newspaper blames the government officials, essentially saying that the government officials in Kazakhstan, they come from sort of more, Russian-dominated families, and they don't really care that much about Kazakh language because they still are much more comfortable with using Russian. And a newspaper says, well, if you don't care about Kazakh language, then we will have to, ask somebody to substitute you because we want to see stricter policies. Stricter policies in terms of Kazakh language implementation, Kazakh language usage in here. And yeah, so there is a fair amount of this sort of narratives. I will perhaps also maybe share some cartoons in again related very much to the question of language use, but not only. This is a cartoon from again Solar newspaper published in 1988, of course a long time ago, but still very much interesting. Here we have a picture of a lady, and this lady is Natalia Korzhova. So at that point, she was a finance minister of the country. So finance minister of the country. And the entire, well, you can't really see the entire title here, but the entire title was Memleketlik Minister. So a minister who does not respect the state language. And here, again, this cartoon portrays some people coming to her asking maybe for something. And here we have to remember 1990s, in late 90s was a very difficult time in terms of economic development in the country. A lot of issues were there, but she is portrayed as sort of arrogantly keeping people away, and she's also comfortably sitting on the book, the cover of which says Kazakh language. So she is essentially being criticized for not being fluent in Kazakh language. And that sort of narrative was also quite popular back then. Another cartoon, this is more related to the whole, again, 50-50 sort of quota that exists in the media. Just for the context, when this legislation was introduced, many, not all, but quite a few of the local TV channels, in order to formally comply with requirement, they put a lot of Kazakh language broadcasts. So they had to broadcast in Kazakh, but content wasn't available back then. Of course, now it's quite different, but back then filling up this quota was difficult. So a lot of times they put all the Kazakh language broadcasts late at night. So after midnight, the entire broadcast was in Kazakh, and for the most part, it was just music, video clips, wasn't very sort of entertaining quality-wise. But here, and all the prime time TV broadcast was broadcast in Russian. So here, this cartoon essentially makes a case for this situation. Sort of making fun of the situation. Essentially, here we on the left we have a sign called a TV, so televidение in Russian, and then on the night side here, on the right side here, we have a TD, which stands for Teletidar, so TV in Kazakh. And here we have some people who wanted to watch some TV, but because the only time they could watch TV in Kazakh is late at night, so everybody is sort of falling asleep, and many other TV channels, or I guess not TV channels, but media outlets were making ironic comments about this situation, essentially saying that Kazakhs will eventually turn into a nation of late night TV watchers, because again, the only time Kazakhs can watch TV is past midnight. And of course, here, as I said, things have changed quite a bit. Now, quality-wise, content-wise, of course, it's a lot more balanced. There's a lot more interesting and quite decent quality content available in Kazakh, which was not the case back then. So almost 20 years ago, situation was indeed quite different. Another cartoon, this is again from Dressage, but narrating about this whole, what we can see maybe in some other, well, Central Asian, but also some European countries perhaps, where they exploit the whole so-called hospitality argument. Sort of here in this cartoon, which says Kazakh Teres, or Kazakh language. So Bayagda, so a long time ago, everything was great. Kazakhs were living in yurtas, playing dombras, everything was terrific. And then what happened? Keshe, so yesterday there is a sort of Russian language coming to the yurt, and Kazakh language politely, is inviting them to the, to the inside the yurt, to the most hospitable place, to the most sort of respected place. And then Bugun, so what happens today, Bugun is that, we have Russian language being comfortably sort of sitting inside, and Kazakh, or Kazakh language for that matter, are not even being allowed inside. So they do indeed sort of show, well, we let them in, and now we are in this very much secondary or subordinate sort of position. So that's the media discourse. And again, if anybody is interested, I can talk a lot more about those narratives in the media and perhaps more recent trends. But again, this is the situation with the I guess, media discourses. And very briefly before we conclude, I perhaps show maybe some of the results of the societal reaction. We'll talk about societal narratives. So there was a project that me and my friend and colleague, Dina Sharipova, another Indiana University graduate, by the way, did a few years ago in Kazakhstan. It was a project that was sponsored or supported partially at least by the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. So we did a nationwide survey in the country. The number of respondents was 1,600 across the country, including regions and cities, Almaty and Astana then. We also, we asked a few questions related to the issues of identity. How do people perceive themselves? Whether Kazakhstani or Kazakh is sort of more acceptable identification. And the results here, I'll just share some of the results. So here we can see that, there's a fair amount of people who tend to be saying that, well, we prefer to be labeled as Kazakhstani. So the civic identity marker was, interestingly enough, getting more popularity back then. And there are some other studies, more recent ones, that should suggest that this trend is very much ongoing. So there is some sort of a shift where people tend to accept that, there is a civic sort of nationhood identification, Kazakhstani, where, whereas ethnic identification, is, while still important, is maybe not the primary one. So that it's, we do see a little bit of a trend like that. We also ask a very important question, perhaps, that well, in a lot of scholarship, I think we can see the the discourses about this question, and this question, well, it's a lot more. It might seem very simple, yet it looks well. It is perhaps a lot more difficult to answer. So, what does it mean to be Kazakhstani? What is this something that that unites people here? And we ask questions. So, is it what, in order to be Kazakhstani, what kind of conditions are a prerequisite? Is it citizenship? Is it to be born in Kazakhstan? Is it to be living in Kazakhstan for a while, or speaking Kazakh, or being a Muslim? And as we can see, again, many people would highlight the citizenship aspect. Some people would say, it's 30%, rather significant, and significant is almost 55%. Born in Kazakhstan, important, but somewhat, maybe somewhat less. Whereas, even language, well, language also got a fair amount of support, although maybe somewhat less universal. Religion was considered pretty much, being a Muslim was pretty much irrelevant for being a Kazakhstani. Then we asked the question, if you have to visualize, so what would be the symbol of Kazakhstan? What can be considered as some more sort of accepted visual symbol of Kazakhstan? And we came up with all kinds of options people could choose. People could choose multiple options here, as you can see here, the golden man, this costume of a tribal leader of Assoc, a prince or princess, perhaps it's still very much under exploration, found near Issyk in Almaty, got a lot of sort of approval. Then we asked, what other symbols, and then we have a Bayterek tower in Astana or Nur-Sultan, the Dombra, the musical instrument, and the yurt, which scored fairly high in those. And here, I think in general, we can also say that, Dombra and yurt are perhaps more associated with obviously Kazakh ethnic culture, although a bit more complex than that. Whereas the costume here of the Golden Man, as well as Bayterek Tower, this is a bit more civic oriented in general. We can probably say that with some degree of confidence. Again, Sak tribes are, of course, happen to live in Kazakhstan, but the connection between them and sort of, Kazakh ethnicity is a bit more distant. Then we also asked a few follow-up questions. So about the language. So which language you consider your mother tongue? Many people still highlighted Kazakh. But here, again, we have to make an important disclaimer. There is still a lot of focus on the very Soviet understanding of родной язык, native tongue or mother language or mother tongue, where if someone is a Kazakh, then indeed Kazakh should be their mother tongue. But then we ask the proficiency level, and we see that again there are more divergent results in terms of how often people actually use or how well they know the language. And also, I guess we also asked questions, but I won't go into details here because for the sake of timing, but I'll share maybe some other results about identity questions that we asked. We asked the question, well, I'd rather be a citizen of Kazakhstan than of any other country. And yes, a fair amount of people responded positively to that, agree and rather agree. I think we are talking about 90+%. When Kazakhstani athletes are successful, it makes you feel proud, and indeed most people would also agree with that. But then we asked a question that for some might seem somewhat provocative, yet it was important to ask perhaps. So people must support the country even if it's doing something wrong. And here I think results would be also interesting, so that more than 70% said, well, yes, indeed, you need to support your country even if it's doing something wrong. So again, it's a bit more of a provocative, admittedly, question, but it was interesting to see the societal responses, societal reactions. Then we also said, well, testing the sort of patriotic sentiments vis-a-vis Kazakhstan, we also asked a few questions that would allow perhaps to see how, sort of from a material perspective, how patriotic people are. And here we asked the question, so are we ready to pay more for something that is made in Kazakhstan? And a fair amount of people said yes, but also a fair amount of people was not quite on board with this and said, well, it's almost 45% said that, well, I'm not quite ready to pay more for something, even if it's made in Kazakhstan. We also asked questions. So when I go shopping, I prefer buy stuff made in Kazakhstan. And again, this did not really get the same amount of approval as other questions. And we asked the question, so I'm proud to wear something, clothing that says Kazakhstan on it. And here, most people would be actually endorsing this. So more than 70% said, yes, indeed, of course. So again, we can say perhaps that indeed the civic sentiments are indeed growing. And I think in general, there is broader acceptance of the term, Kazakhstani, and more people tend to identify themselves in more civic terms. And at the same time, we're still talking about a society in which ethnic narratives are still very much present, very much important. And I think perhaps, challenges for the future decades, perhaps, is to harmonize this very distinct narratives that exist in two linguistic realms. And I think, of course, there are many countries in which, two or more languages are being used in public discourses, but this degree of alienation, this degree of gap between the two linguistic realms is something that perhaps needs to be addressed somehow by the government, because otherwise we might see something that's going on in other places where we're talking about two different worlds with their own narratives, with their own very different visions for the country, for the future of the country. So this is something that perhaps again government might want to address. All right, on that note, I'll stop here because it's 40 minutes so that we have more time for Q&A, and I'll be happy to take questions and to discuss those things in detail. So thanks very much once again, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz. Thank you very much. This was like, I didn't really feel that it was already 40 minutes. So it was pretty interesting, and particularly the research results are also, you said you conducted with Dina, right? A few years ago, yeah. My question will be regarding this incident that, that took place a few weeks ago. It's about Russia's claims of the, again, the Northern Territory. And a couple of years ago, I think it was 2015, there was also a comment on the questioning the statehood of Kazakhstan historically. So to what extent, as far as I follow from, I can follow from the Kazakh media, it's sounds like a big deal, but I'm not sure to what extent this is really viewed threatening by people, maybe among those your informants who agree, disagree. Among these different categories of the society, how would they view, for example, this as a real threat, or it's just a discourse which was?
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, that's a very complex question. I'll try to maybe briefly respond to that. I think we have to also perhaps distinguish some periods within that sort of discourse related to statements made by some of the Russian politicians. I think, well, the most important reaction, of course, was to the statement made by President Putin about, that Kazakhstan never had boundaries or never had a statehood. And to that, I think the government took it very seriously, and legitimately so, perhaps. I think this statement had important domestic implications. And I think in 2015, a massive celebration was launched to celebrate the 550th anniversary of Kazakh Khanate, or Kazakh Kingdom, medieval Kazakh Kingdom. And the message was pretty clear. We had a statehood. We did not come from nowhere. We did not come from scratch. We had a statehood. We have a history. Celebration was very much supported by the government. It was, a massive celebration was launched. So that was, taken with some degree of, concern. After that, I think there was an important domestic policy mechanism implemented, which included state sponsoring program of migration of ethnic Kazakhs from the south to northern areas of Kazakhstan. And I don't know the details, but there were some economic incentives for them to do so. So in terms of jobs and opportunities and subsidies and so on. So those claims were indeed, again, taken with quite a bit of concern. Latest statements, however, the ones that were made last year, for example, by Duma members, by some other regional Russian politicians, they did not cause that sort of governmental sort of policy response. But on the level of public discourse, of course, yes, there was a big discussion as well. And I think the common response was that, well, they of course don't know much about history. Kazakhs living, have been living there, have been living on those territories. This is not a gift. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So we're talking about two different, I guess, time periods. So perhaps it also depends on who is actually making those statements. So the origin, the source of those statements perhaps may play a role. So obviously coming from the top levels of Russian political hierarchy, that was taken as a concern. Coming from sort of middle to lower hierarchy in the Russian political sort of system, perhaps it wasn't that much of a concern or that much of a threat by the government. But indeed, I think in terms of policy, in terms of public discourse, however, discussions were still very much alive. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, thank you. I think Kazakhstan is doing a really good job in the recent years, particularly like doing some projects investigating the history, and like really serious scholarly projects these are kind of will shed light on that particular periods of time, and I think it's a good development in terms of Kazakh history writing. Thank you, Aziz.
I may take the second question. Thank you very much, first of all, a really great presentation. And I really like one slides that you share with us about the article of this Kazakh discourse from Kazakh discourse paper that says there is no other country like Kazakhstan where the language is, used the same way. Actually, there are plenty, and all of them are neighbors with Russia. The common sense. So, like my first question will be, after we saw for what Russia can do in Georgia and in Ukraine, taking Crimea, and the language issue was one of the crucial for this occupation and for starting a war. I mean, the formal reason was to protect Russian speakers. So after all these events, did the discourse in Kazakhstan changed in any way? And is there any discussions that actually language is not just about identity, but it's mostly in case if you are neighbors with Russia, it's case of national security. And it's a weapon, it's very strong weapon for Russia to influence for people mind, and it's actually language of propaganda, very strong propaganda that, you mentioned about the two different discourses, why there are two different discourses, because on another discourse, other states can influence. Yes, so is there any changes? So this is my first one.
Okay. Indeed, very complex question. I think in general, there were changes, and I think after 2014, I think we do especially see changes vis-a-vis vis-a-vis Russia. Really, I think what we have seen previously is that again, two discourses and very different narratives in those. But then one thing I noticed after 2014 and onwards is some sort of a fusion of two discourses that would not necessarily even talk to each other before. So what do I mean? So after, again, 2014, 2015, and onwards, we see more common discourse between people who would be advocating, the purely Kazakh language discourse, sort of Kazakh language discourse, what more, took a very, harsh stance. And then we also have this Russian language discourse of, this urban, urban dwellers, urban, populace. And this discourse, these two discourses would have, the two narratives would have very little in common otherwise. And yet after 2014, I think we do see a lot more in common in those. And this is interesting. So that foreign policy issues, this whole, debates around this, they did indeed influence the domestic discourses on language. So in other words, the two audiences that, two groups in the society that would otherwise have very little in common, we're talking about, rural Kazakhs and, primarily Kazakh speaking, and also, a lot of this sort of, very eloquent, sort of intelligentsia, primarily Russian language, dominant, they would be, a lot more closer to each other vis-a-vis, Russia's actions in, in the former Soviet space. So that I think is a very important change. That said, though, I think it's also worth mentioning that, as you mentioned, Russian media outlets are very much popular in Kazakhstan, and there is a fair amount of media presence. So of course we have to also account for that. And that's why perhaps many people in Russia would endorse. Many people in Kazakhstan would also, somewhat sympathetically endorse Russia's action. So I think there are some big changes, but one big change that I mentioned is that two groups in society that would otherwise have little in common, they would actually come together in this specific sort of case. I don't know if we can extrapolate this further, but there's one change like that is worth mentioning.
I have just one very small question about during Soviet times, Russians, who generally don't speak local languages like Kazakh in your case, they had this idea of superiority of Russian. So like if you, for example, I can give some examples from Ukraine. So if someone talked to them in Ukrainian, they say, can you talk a normal language? The language of human or something like that. Is there right now, what the situation is right now? What the attitude of Russians toward Kazakh language, let's say right now, and did it change during the independence period?
Well, those stories, I don't think they're really that different for the Soviet part, and especially in the northern part of the country. But even, in my childhood years, urban areas for the most part were very Russian areas. And I think city of Almaty, which is the capital of Soviet Kazakhstan, had only one or two Kazakh schools. That was not a boarding school. So of course, cities were very much Russian speaking. And I think in terms of superiority, of course, Russian was, fluency in Russian was a sort of prerequisite of any successful career in the Soviet society. I think that's pretty clear. And that's why perhaps, quite a few of ethnic Kazakhs back then preferred to, send their kids to Russian language institutions or schools at least, or kindergartens. Because they wanted, their kids to be successful in the Soviet society, which by and large implied, being fluent in Russian. But that said, I think this kind of debate has changed. Again, at least in public discourse, we see much less of this sort of superiority sort of sentiments. They may exist, and I'm sure they do, but at least in public discourse, the tonality is a lot more moderate, I would say. I don't think there is really that sort of negativity expressed vis-a-vis Russian, but I guess vis-a-vis Kazakh. But I guess the core of the issue is still that despite many programs that have been introduced in order to promote Kazakh language, it's still many of those programs have not really been that successful, and I think there is an interesting discussion in the scholarship about this. But many argue that because of this programs, I guess the progress or the expansion of Kazakh language that happened is not necessarily because of those programs. It's because of the demographic changes that happened, and I think it's by and large sort of not a result of those policies, but perhaps the opposite. So I think country is a lot more Kazakh speaking than it used to be even 10, let alone 20 years ago. That's for sure. At the same time, how how much credit can we give to the specifically government programs? That I think would not be as certain here, because well, many point out that many of those programs have not been realistic, have not been thought well, designed well, and I think in general, well, I think we should probably ask Professor Firman, who is who's been studying language policy for a lot more than all of us here, perhaps. But his argument is that the teaching, the quality of teaching hasn't changed that much, and whereas still when it comes to Kazakh language education, a lot of focus is still on memorizing, on this very mechanic sort of memorization of things instead of promoting communication skills. So that I think is absolutely a valid point here.
Thank you very much. And we have some questions from audience, and I guess Ellen has a question.
Ellen, yeah.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you, Aziz.
Hi, question.
Hello, organizers. We've seen each other for a couple of weeks ago. Aziz, I have a question. I know this research very well because I assign it in my class. One thing that you didn't mention, but that I thought was a very interesting finding, was that in the survey you asked the question, do you feel more closely connected to Oralmans, who are Kazakhs from abroad, from China or Kazakhstan, for instance, closer to them or to Russians? And the majority of respondents said that they felt closer to Russians than, was it the majority or at least a great proportion? So I thought this was very interesting, because if ethnic identity is so strong, then how come people feel closer to people who they are close to geographically and not necessarily ethnically? So this was very interesting. And when I mentioned that in my class, there was a reaction from one student, and students were pretty upset about that. And one of them crossed his arms and said, "It's not true." And I said, "I'm not making this up. This is the result of the survey." But, and some students with more nuanced opinions about that were saying, because the survey, if you could remind us what year this is maybe 6-7 years ago.
That was 2016, so yeah, 5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. So some other students were saying, "Oh, I'm sure this has changed now because of the situation of in the repression in China, in Western China, and that people are getting used to Kazakhs from abroad coming to Kazakhstan, and because they are often characterized as more traditional, and they don't know Russian specifically, that they are, so they are a bit alien to Kazakhstan." And I have another question connected to this as well. So the question was, do you think there was a change in the perception of Kazakhs coming from abroad, especially in terms, because they are persecuted abroad in China? And the second question is, one thing that I noticed is that there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are violent clashes between Kazakh communities and different ethnic communities. Once in a while, maybe once every 2 years or something. The last one in Masanchi in southern Kazakhstan was very violent, with 21 people died, I think. It was between Dungans and Kazakhs. And there were other instances between Tajiks and the Chechens, but never against Russian communities. So that's, I think, ethnic conflicts never occur with ethnic Russians. So that's also a bit puzzling to me, and I think it's a good research topic, actually. So why are conflicts are mostly taking place in rural areas? So maybe that's the reason why Russian communities are found mostly in urban areas. So I don't know. So I would like to have your thoughts about that. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks very much, Ellen. Again, very to the point questions, but also very complex ones. So first question, in terms of attitude towards ethnic Kazakhs migrating back to the country, I think it's worth mentioning that, of course, this survey was done 5 years ago, so things may have changed, especially with regards to what's going on in Xinjiang. That said, though, I think for quite a while, there were issues with integration in some areas of the country, at least. And here we have Dr. Ishik, who has done extensive research on the Oromans, so she can probably tell us more. But my understanding was that for quite a while, issues of integration were there. Not only this, but also a fair amount of this whole question of entitlement, I think, was there because when the government made a lot of promises to ethnic Kazakhs migrating back from China, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, other places, usually the Oromans, or Kandas, as they are now called, are offered a fairly substantial package of support, of subsidies, and many people inside the country were questioning this and saying, well, back in the 1930s, when Kazakhstan went through famine, through starvation, where 2 million people died, there were Stalin's repressions and purges. Again, many people were killed. We stayed in the country and we survived, and we kept going. Whereas they moved away to China, to Afghanistan, to wherever. They escaped, and now they're coming back to Kazakhstan, and they're receiving all this amount of help, subsidies, all kinds of perks that we living in the country we don't. We don't receive this kind of support from the government. So I think it's more related to that sort of tonality here. They come back, and sure, they are Kazakhs, but we have been going through all those very difficult times, and we survived, and we don't get that kind of support from our government. Whereas they are they escaped to safety, they lived there, and now they're coming back, and they are given all this privileges. So I think at least partially perception of the Oromans for a while was inspired by this sort of sentiment of supposed or alleged entitlement of sorts. But also obviously, coming from different countries, obviously, Russian fluency or lack thereof was also an issue. Also, the Kazakh language itself, they, because having lived in China or Mongolia for a while, obviously there are some maybe minor, but still some linguistic differences as well. So people, so there were issues with integration. I think now, especially with what's going on in Xinjiang, things have changed quite a bit. I think a lot more sympathetic attitudes are being expressed. Our co-ethnics, our fellow co-ethnics are being treated badly in across the border. So and they come, they seek for asylum, and Kazakhstan's government is also trying to not to jeopardize relationship with China. So there's a very tricky geopolitical sort of aspect, but many people are a lot more sympathetic to the Oromans, I guess, these days. I think that would be a great follow-up study, of course, but for the time being, I think just sort of anecdotally, I can say perhaps that, yes, there is some change in the tonality here. So, and also, very good question about the ethnic conflicts. Again, government of Kazakhstan does indeed take pride in the absence of this, sort of large-scale ethnic conflicts, but it does not mean that ethnic conflicts did not happen. In fact, there were quite a few of those last year in the southern Kazakhstan, in the place called Masanchi, in Kordai district. But there were several other incidents between Kazakhs and Tajiks, Kazakhs and Chechens, and Malavodny and Shelek, Kazakhs and Uyghurs. So there's a series of conflicts, and it is a very interesting question: why do they occur? And I had a chance to speak with some of the people from Assembly people who are studying, investigating those conflicts, and I can rely on this sort of again rather anecdotal evidence. But a lot of that would be related to the fact that we're talking about largely closed communities. So communities that are existing in a sort of semi-isolated locality. So where language or even sort of presence of Kazakhstan sort of power isn't quite there yet, because I think some of the experts who studied this, they mentioned that there were places in some of those areas in which, unlike in most other schools in the country, flag would not be rising, people would not sing national anthem and stuff like that. So at some point, there was a question of how integrated this place is to the rest of the country. And then there was also a question of language, in a sense that a lot of these, well, at least some of those places, they have schools in local languages, in Dungan specifically in the last year's context, but there are also other schools in which children, get education in the regional, the local language. And in principle, that is sort of important, sort of multiculturalism sort of tool. Yet at the same time, it turns out that because children graduate from those schools, they're unable to take the YENT, the Unified National Test, which is sort of entrance to the university, because YENT is only offered in Kazakh and Russian. So that's because of this, because they take education in, let's say, Uzbek or Dungan, they're unable to take the entrance university test, and that's why they're unable to enter universities, the state grants, and that's why they prefer to go to places like Kyrgyzstan, for example, or other countries in Central Asia for education. So here, this is a sort of broader policy question. So, the whole question of school education in the local language. In principle, one could argue it's an important tool, an important opportunity to study in their language, to get, secondary education in their language. Yet at the same time, it turns out that it also puts them in this very, vulnerable position because of this, they're unable to take the university entrance test. And of course, they have very little motivation to, study, Kazakh or being, sort of being part of the Kazakhstani society because their thoughts are already, elsewhere. So there is that, and of course, obviously, there are other issues such as, corruption and all kinds of local, patron-client relationship in given districts where, local governor, local, some pretty rich families can establish all kinds of ties with the local police department, with local, tax office or whatever, where there may be a situation where, some of the ethnic Kazakhs may develop the sentiment that they are being, sort of in this second-class position in their own, homeland, whereas ethnic minorities are sort of taking over. So there are a lot of all kinds of issues here, but some common features in those inter-ethnic conflicts that happened, perhaps we can connect it with the specifics of this isolated communities, more specifically, in the case of Tajik community here or Dungan community or others. And I know for a fact that there was a follow-up study conducted by the Assembly of People, and there may be changes in the government policy related to integration, the further integration of these communities.
Okay, and if we have any questions, so please could you raise your hands or write your questions in the chat section. And meanwhile, can I use my position of one of the moderator and ask another question? Because okay, you were about Ishik, go on. If you were,
I was just gonna ask something about or complement the Kandastar issue a little bit. I'm kind of still researching on that. I'm curious, and maybe just quick brief thing since we're already there. I'm kind of assuming that there was always this discussion of in a demographic terms, quantity, quality wise, I mean, that kind of stuff. But I don't think any former Soviet republics had even such a hike in demographics like Kazakhstan. It's almost 19 million. And I think it's a big thing. I mean, even whether they're Kazakh or not, ethnic Kazakhs or not, but a lot of this population is due to not pronatal policies, but obviously to ethnic return migration. And having Kazakh speakers in the country complements all these policies. I mean, slowly but surely, perhaps the country is, and I think people, even though who are not totally, I don't know the research results, I was kind of surprised too. There will always be such elements, but I think in any kind of ethnic return migration, the case of Germany or Israel, I also looked at in my dissertation. I mean, any kind of migration, refugee, host society relations, there's always these tensions. But after a while, like 30, 50 years later, Turkey is again a country who received a lot of people from the Balkans, from the Caucasus, and back in the time, obviously we said, yeah, these are our brothers, whatever. But at the same time, there was kind of resentment. I mean, where are they getting this land? We're not getting it like for free. But I think after a while, all these are, you know, kind of smoothen up more, so people do not feel that kind of tension. Just wanted to say that maybe it takes time. And regarding the Kazakhs in Xinjiang, I think a lot of the time, which are Uyghurs are really important in there, but I think Kazakhs are suffering the same amount, same way. And sometimes I feel that we don't, or the media or you know, they not paid enough attention to their sufferings. And I think it's getting better. There was a New York Times a New Yorker article recently about this Kazakh lady and how she suffered in Xinjiang, the camps. And so anyhow, I just wanted to say that. Sorry, Yulia, I'm done. Okay.
Okay, I thought it was a kind of not just comment but question, so I was waiting for the response. Actually, my question will be about the generation you mentioned. I mean, that new generation is coming and the situation is changing. Is it really the new generation is more, let's say, pro-Kazakhstani and using more Kazakh language than Russian? Because like in, especially if we look, I don't know, in social media, yeah, in TikTok or whatever, most users, for example, in Ukraine prefer a new generation, very strange, someone who were born already after 1991. They use mostly Russian than Ukrainian. I mean, to be connected in with the world or whatever. So like, when you expect young generation to be more nationalistic, I mean, I wouldn't say nationalistic, but at least speaking of the language of your country, in reality, you see something vice versa. I mean, what about Kazakhstan in this case?
Well, very interesting question, and very interesting thing you said about Ukrainian sort of generational changes. I think in Kazakhstan, generational question is very important, and I think, well, there was an edited volume that we did a couple of years ago about youth in Kazakhstan, and I think there was a reference point essentially that at this point in time, more than 50% of population of Kazakhstan is born after 1991. So we're talking about a society that is fairly young overall. And of course, this question of generation, of changes of generation is very important, and not just in Kazakhstan, but in other places we see around the world. I think in general, I would probably frame it through this whole, sort of Engelhardt-inspired division about, expression values and survival values. And I think, for this last Soviet generation, to which I guess, well, I would perhaps belong, and as well as many of my peers and colleagues, for us, of course, going through, let's say, 1990s was a challenge because, at that point, even in big cities, like Almaty, you could have power shortages of, water shortages of, for hours or days even sometimes. And of course, economic development was at that point very much, a challenge. And, people working, couldn't receive salaries for a month sometimes. We're talking about a very challenging time. And of course, for this generation, going through those challenges, of course, question of survival is very important. So, we might not care, well, I guess, we collectively, maybe as a generation, might not care that much about, all this sort of expression priorities. The question was really to survive. Whereas next generation, who was lucky enough, I guess, to be growing through this whole question of economic growth in Kazakhstan in the early 2000s, this oil-inspired, of course, but still very impressive economic growth, nonetheless. They take a lot of those things for granted, so that there's always water and there is always electricity and there is no so that street lights would always be working, and no any other that sort of economic issues. So they, of course, they take priority in expression values. So for them, to be engaged in, to make their voices heard in politics and, in domestic discussions and whatever. Those are more important things. And of course, I think that extrapolates to politics. I think in many other places, well, I think it's in Kazakhstan too. I think this whole question of the whole discourse about stability, about survival, is just not very much appealing to them anymore, because they see their interests elsewhere. They want to create, to have this creative atmosphere, to express themselves, to travel, to do all kinds of things. That of course also has a challenge, has an implication for the identity question. Of course, I think in general, people would be rising or living in Kazakhstan, being born in independent Kazakhstan, and that's very different compared to previous generation, which was born in when Soviet Union was still around. So of course, I think it has a very direct implication. Whether or not the next generation is more Kazakh speaking, I would say yes. I think in general, we do see changes domestically. Just looking at the statistics, for example, when I was in college years, and that was a long time ago, of course, but at that point, many universities around the country, they would have the student composition studying in Kazakh and in Russian, and the ratio would be roughly 50-50. So approximately half studying in Kazakh and studying in Russian. Whereas latest statistics, if we look at for example, UNT, the Unified National Test, University Entrance Test statistics, because you can choose in which language you want to take it, in Russian or in Kazakh. And the statistics are that 85% or so take it in Kazakh, or only 15, maybe a little more percent take it in Russian. So we're talking about a very different linguistic pattern here. Of course, the younger generation is a lot more Kazakh speaking, but important disclaimer has to be made. Is it because of government policies promoting Kazakh language? That I'm very much skeptical about. I think it will probably more associated with just demographic changes. A lot of ethnic Kazakhs families have multiple children, so demographic changes, more opportunities, and also out-migration of ethnic Russians or Slavs from the northern part of the country, where and I think in general Russian universities also are very proactive in offering all kinds of entrance tests for to universities where ethnic Russian students may, or applicants, I guess, graduates may apply for admission to Tomsk or Novosibirsk or other universities, and they offer all kinds of packages and stipends and whatnot, and many people take those. If you look at average age of ethnic Russian population, that is also getting higher, because usually the older generation stays and younger generation prefers to leave. So we're talking about the major demographic changes in I guess in this current next generation, if you will. And indeed, the country has become a lot more Kazakh speaking. But again, is it because of government policies? That I would not be certain. I think it's a lot more connected with demographic changes. But country is a lot more Kazakh speaking than it used to be even 10 years ago.
Okay, thank you. We have a next question from Pal, and then we will come to Safa. So, Pal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My name is Padon. I am Hungarian, but living in Germany, and I'm very glad to be here. I will make a short comment, and then I will ask a question. And the short comment is that when I first came to Kazakhstan, and you may be surprised, it was in 1979, after a Stroya Triad in Novosibirsk, we started to travel around, and it was very good that we got to Kazakhstan and to Almaty. I asked the question from law students, as I am a lawyer by training. The question was, so you all study in Kazakh at the university? And I said, no, we all study in Russian. I said, why don't you study in Kazakh? He said, because we want to be integrated in the Soviet Union. So precisely what you mentioned. 3 days later in Tashkent, I asked the same question. So you are all studying in Russian? I said, no. Sometimes we can't even run Russian classes because everybody wants to study in Uzbek. And I said, oh, there must be something. So this must be a very interesting topic for comparative analysis. And of course, Kazakhstan is the richest, the most developed. I used to live in Kyrgyzstan for 2 years between 2014, 2016. So my question is, there are approximately 3 million Kazakhs, if I'm not mistaken, who don't speak any other language than their mother tongue. Until 1991, I understand that the Soviet Union had a strong Russian cultural cohesion and so on and so forth. But what would you offer to those people, generally in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan, who do not possess any other language than their mother tongue? Because, of course, if you want to become an intellectual, if you want to travel, if you want to get a degree abroad, one of the major languages must be with you, be it English, Russian, Chinese. So do you have an idea where this is going, you know? Because I'm not so much worried about those Kazakhs who are fluent in another language like you are, but I'm worried about those people who are basically eclipsing themselves, you know, and constraining themselves in the region. And of course, Kazakhstan is a rich country, so Kazakhstan can offer something good for the population. But the country I used to live, Kyrgyzstan, and I used to travel, of course, all the others, may be less promising.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Just to clarify, we're talking about people who are only fluent in Kazakh, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, got it. Well, I think in general, there is a fair amount of people who are fluent in Kazakh only, especially in the southern parts of the country. There are areas where Russian language is not used much, if at all. So that has indeed changed. Back in the Soviet time, of course, language fluency in Russian was, of course, an entry ticket to higher sort of successful career in the Soviet society. But specifically for the Kazakh speakers, I think in general, in most schools, you would still have Russian class. Russian class would be their English class. Of course, quality depends very much. It's very much fluctuates, of course, across the country. So it's hard to tell about sort of any kind of average level, but I would argue that still, I think many people would have at least some kind of knowledge of other languages, Russian or English, maybe limited, of course, but further career opportunities, further language choices would, of course, very much be dependent on, what they see. Of course, I think in terms of educational opportunities, what I'm thinking about, of course, we have the Balashak program, which sponsors, students going abroad for studies. Also, there is a niche system, Nazarbayev intellectual schools, which offer this sort of trilingual education model of, well, primarily English speaking though. So there are opportunities, and I think in general, people realize that, well, knowing other languages is also important for future career. Of course, economic opportunities are different across population, and perhaps there are people, who would prioritize Kazakh over other languages or cannot afford language courses. I think that certainly exists. Yet at the same time, I think in general, I don't think we are talking about sort of, this sort of attitude, of preferring speaking only in Kazakh. I think people would be aware that, at least, maybe even if Russian language usage is in decline, but, English is kind of important. So it's hard to tell. I think in general, people would have at least some, maybe very basic sort of knowledge of other languages. And then if they prefer, if they want to, pursue any kind of, sort of a study abroad path, I think English would be a prerequisite, of course. I think in general, at the same time, I guess my point here is that before, in terms of, if you're just fluent in Kazakh language, a lot, I guess before that, even I would probably say 20 years ago, opportunities might be rather limited. I think now, because there is a lot more presence, a lot more usage of Kazakh across the country in business and in government, obviously, in other areas. Even if you're fluent only in Kazakh, you can still make a fairly successful career domestically, in public service, in business, and as a, I don't know, social media blogger or whatever, there is enough audience and there is enough content to be produced. So I guess that's the major change. So if before, fluency in Kazakh would be a limiting factor, whereas now it's actually an asset and people would be, using it. So I think that would be the difference. But I'm also interesting. I find it interesting that you mentioned the Soviet moment, a Soviet situation where in the 70s, where education in Kazakhstan, university education in Kazakhstan would primarily be available only in Russian, whereas in Uzbekistan and some other former Soviet republics, fluency in local languages was there. I think in general, I think Kazakhstan and perhaps Belarus are perhaps the most affected by Russian language sort of dominance. But other Central Asian countries, even Uzbekistan, I think in general, by and large, preserved the fluency in Uzbek. There was actually quite the opposite. There, in fact, it was not uncommon to find an ethnic Russian who would be a little bit fluent in Uzbek. So I think in general, again, situation was not quite the same in between different former Soviet republics.
Okay, and we have very interesting question from Safar about interethnic marriages. So Safar, if you would like to ask your question in person, please.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Burkhanov. I want to ask that, firstly, I want to say that I cannot remember the data from the survey well. Maybe it was included in the survey, but I want to ask that what is the situation among the children of mixed marriages? For example, the Russian and Kazakh marriages. Do they consider themselves ethnically Kazakh at any level? I want to ask that.
Right, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give any specific answer here. We did not account for that in this survey. Of course, now retrospectively, I think we should have, but no, we don't have that kind of data in the statistics. Anecdotally, though, I can say that indeed there are, growing number of interethnic marriages. But that's a very good question to ask about, identity to interview. Maybe a future project. Unfortunately, I don't have any sort of specific information on that.
Okay, thank you.
I will check the chat. Do we have any other questions? If not, so I have one more, the last one probably from me. I was very surprised when you showed the ID card new ID card. I know that it was in the old passports, but first of all, that two languages are used there. And it's not Kazakh and English. What was very surprised to me, it was Kazakh and Russian. So the other very surprised fact for me was that, the current government, they support this discourse of, peacefully living in the country and etc. So let's forget about our ethnic roots on the one side. And on the other side, they save this nationality, Nationalist. So, it's kind of, I know that probably they try to continue the Soviet story about the nations and etc. But it's very interesting if they decide that, okay, let's forget about our ethnic roots. So why do they preserve this nationality? Because I guess it's only, even in Russia, they eliminated this. I don't know any other countries do they have, but in Ukraine, in Russia, they definitely, we don't have, at least. It was eliminated in 90s. Okay.
Yeah, excellent question. In fact, actually, this is, that answering that question kind of allows me to maybe summarize the whole nation building project in Kazakhstan in general. I would perhaps say with some degree of certainty that there are some very interesting and quite often very contradicting elements in that project. Indeed, On the one hand, there are attempts to build up or to come up with some sort of a unifying ideas such as Kazakhstani nation, where regardless of ethnic origin, everybody is sort of member of the Kazakhstani nation. Yet at the same time, on the backside of our ID cards, we still have the Nationalist graph or old nationality or ethnic origin, really. Which of course does not quite match, the idea of unifying, uniting everybody. At the same time, if you look at some other discourse, there's a lot of focus on Kazakh ethnic culture. There are toponymics or even interpretation of history, history textbooks. There's a lot more focus on specifically ethnic Kazakh culture, ethnic Kazakh, heroes of the past became prominent figures in history discourse and history textbooks, for example. So it's a very interesting element. At the same time, there are some elements from what is oftentimes referred as multiculturalist approach, where, for example, in the government, or I guess in the parliament, there is a quota for ethnic minorities, ethnic groups elected through the assembly of people. So lower halves of the parliament, I think 9 seats are reserved for ethnic minorities. So I guess in a nutshell, I think we can probably summarize this, whole sort of, nation building project in Kazakhstan as very, including very contradicting elements. I think in general, declaration of Kazakhstani nation, yet at the same time, ID card are still showing ethnicity. There is focus on ethnic culture. So I think in general, this was, that's how a national identity project in Kazakhstan historically was developing. Why is it the case? Well, it's hard to say. I think in general, the government deliberately tried to avoid any kind of, politicization of ethnicity. And I think that's perhaps, the example of the Balkans or maybe other, ethnic conflicts that happened in the former Soviet space was sort of a warning sign for the government. The government deliberately tried to, silence those inter-ethnic debates, to, politicize ethnicities and so on. At the same time, there is also the so-called Kazakh nationalist discourse in the country, which is also quite popular, quite prominent, that, says, well, we don't want to have this sort of, idea of the shared statehood. We declare, we consider, this country as the state of Kazakhs. And so there is that sort of narrative as well. So I think, there are several factors which really encourage the government to be very careful about this. And of course, I think when that wasn't in Kazakhstan, but in Kyrgyzstan, when a new set of ID cards was about to be introduced, and I think that was in late 90s, early 2000s. And that one did not have the nationalist graph. And of course, what happened is that people, there was a big societal backlash, and people said, well, we want, our ethnic origin to be stated there. We are not ready to, give it up. And governments stepped back and said, okay, fine, we reintroduce the nationalist graph on their ID cards. And then only, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, they introduced another, I guess, type or model of ID cards, and there, this graph was gone. And this time around, mostly it went smoothly. Well, there were, of course, some people were not very happy with this decision, but for the most part, we can say that, this whole sort of question of ethnicity being recorded, it wasn't as important as it was maybe some time ago. So that means that, societies are changing, and perhaps, of course, that was important at the beginning. Perhaps it is still important for some people now, but over time, we might expect that, this whole ethnic marker being recorded in the ID card might be somewhat less important in the future in Kazakhstan. But at least for the time being, yes, indeed. The country collects the statistics, and it is recorded in the ID cards. And in general, I think when this project of Kazakhstani nation was introduced by the government, societal reaction wasn't very supportive. Many people expressed concerns. I don't want to lose my ethnic identity. I don't want to become Kazakhstani. I still want to be, a Kazakh or Russian or Ukrainian or Tatar or Uzbek or whoever I am. It's important for me, this whole ethnic identity, and I'm not ready to, give it up. So maybe if this would be introduced today or, sometime, this might be a little different, but at least when it was introduced about 10 years ago, reaction was indeed pretty negative. So I guess that just demonstrates that well, some people take all this question of identity very emotionally, and I think in general it is fairly sensitive for many. So the government tried to be very careful about this, very strategic, not to push certain messages too hard. And I think in general, Kazakhstan does deserve credit for avoiding any large scale sort of ethnic violence. Of course, conflicts happen, but comparatively speaking, I think in general, country was doing relatively well.
And what about the public survey opinion polls? Is it allowed to use this division on nationality and check, what group thinks? Because in some countries, I guess they forbid this division. You can, but you cannot ask the ethnic origin or something like that. What about Kazakhstan?
There are different models. There are different models about this. I think French model, deliberately is discouraging sort of asking this kind of question, because the idea is that identity is essentially shared. You're French if you speak French. Sort of that sort of understanding. In other cases in which identity has essentially been constructed. I think Singapore comes to mind. They still record, but they record race. So it's a question of race. There are some other societies which have some identity markers. Depends. Kazakhstan still deliberately focusing on the ethnic identity. So in that sense, we could more probably see this a continuation of the Soviet sort of approach, where nationalist is this institutionalized sort of categorization of sorts in that regard. So in Kazakhstan, this is more of a Soviet-like approach in general, whereas in other countries, it can be different, can be based on race, can be based on other things, and in some cases it is institutionalized. Again, being part of the nation building policy, because as mentioned in Singapore, they do record race, but there is a reason for that, because Singapore, for example, in housing, they have very specific system of quotas, for example, for each of the racial groups. So if a Chinese family wants to buy an apartment in an apartment block and Chinese quota has been filled, they would be denied. So it's a very different kind of social, sort of nation building, nation constructivist sort of approach, if you will. But for Kazakhstan, I think the only tool that I see here is that, again, as I said, 9 members of the parliament are being elected through the assembly of people. So in other words, they are supposed to be representing ethnic minorities. So that's the only sort of institutionalized tool that we can see in national politics.
Oh, okay, so you have this quota for minorities. But the minority is not always a minority, so this is the biggest question.
This is a big question, of course, indeed. But yes, technically speaking, yes, the assembly of people sort of has a venue, and in practice, at least in theory, it's supposed to act as a venue in which ethnic minorities can come and say, well, I have this and this issue. There are debates about how efficient this mechanism is, indeed.
Okay, so if we don't have any questions, so if we have still questions, please raise your hand or open your microphone and ask. If not, we can thank you very, very much for a very great presentation, wonderful presentation, and also very great discussion. Because here we managed to discuss almost all the issues of language policy itself, and identity, and interethnic relations. We have a question from Anton, I guess. Oh no, it wasn't a question. I'm sorry. It was a yeah. I misunderstood the smiles. Yeah.
That's even better. I think that's an applause. So thank you for being with us, I guess. And yeah, Aziz, thanks a lot. Especially, I think I agree with, okay, recording stop. I agree with Yulia that the Q&A was particularly kind of filled out the missing parts that we want to ask, but we couldn't. And so that was a great discussion. And I think Kazakhstan will always be a very important country in the region. So maybe we'll host more and more Aziz and his colleagues in our seminars. Then actually, yeah, next month in June, we have 2 other great speakers on Uyghur cultural heritage, more like anthropology issues. Yet if you can make it, that would be great. We'll announce it, and that will be end of our this year's fall spring seminars, and hopefully we'll start again in September. And I would love to see you.
Thanks again for this invite, and I'm delighted to be part of the series.
Okay, great.
Thanks,
So we can finish and see you in our next seminars.
Sure.
Bye-bye.